Dylan wasn't having the best day. He wasn't having a good day, either. He was having the kind of day that stretched on forever, like a piece of chewing gum stuck to the bottom of your shoe that you can't get rid of no matter how hard you try. Another email, another meeting, another wasted hour spent thinking about all the ways he could get fired for not caring that it wasn't even 5 p.m. yet, and Dylan was already mentally clocking out, lost in the haze of his mid-level office drone life. His cubicle was a corner of beige wallpaper and dull fluorescent lighting. His co-workers, if they could even be called that, seemed like caricatures of themselves: the overworked manager who drank too much coffee, the gossipy HR lady who smiled a little too hard, and the guy in marketing who would probably say something like, "Let's take this offline," if you asked him for the time. The strangest thing about Dylan was his indifference to the world. He wasn't angry or sad, at least not in any dramatic way. He was just there. He had no grand dreams of changing the world, no deep internal conflict he needed to resolve. He wasn't living for anything, really. Most people had at least one thing they were passionate about: work, a hobby, their Netflix queue, but Dylan was just existing in a sea of nothingness. Work, eat, sleep, repeat. He was waiting for something to happen, but he wasn't sure what. It wasn't until the end of his shift that something did happen, and it started with a wrong turn that he had decided to skip the subway that day, instead opting for a walk home to clear his mind. Dylan wasn't particularly concerned with the beauty of the city. He could care less about the scenic parks or art galleries, but something about the unremarkable streets he walked down on autopilot always calmed him. He liked the feeling of being lost in a crowd of faceless people, but today, as he turned a corner he didn't recognize, his feet landed on something different. A narrow alleyway caught his attention, tucked between two old brick buildings that looked like they'd been neglected since the 1960s. There was a neon sign on the wall that simply said, "The Emotional Market." Dylan chuckled to himself, shaking his head. "What the hell?" he muttered, stepping closer. The sign was cheap, flashing intermittently, but it intrigued him for reasons he couldn't fully explain. His mind, a place where logic normally reigned supreme, decided it would be a good idea to check it out. Maybe it was one of those New Age pop-up shops that sold crystals and meditation oils. Or some kind of avant-garde art exhibit. Who knew? He turned into the alley, and the strange feeling intensified as he passed through a rusted door that seemed to materialize from the shadows. The interior was unlike anything Dylan had ever seen. The place smelled faintly of incense, and the walls were adorned with bizarre, psychedelic posters, swirling patterns of color that made no sense at all. The air felt thick, like it was saturated with something intangible. The market was small, yet its oddness gave it a sense of size, as if the space extended beyond the walls and into another dimension. There were stalls lining the walls, each one manned by eccentric-looking individuals. One man was holding a glass jar filled with a milky substance, another had a table full of colorful vials that seemed to shimmer in the low light. At the back of the room, there was a woman, dressed in an old velvet gown, selling what appeared to be bundles of laughter wrapped in transparent cellophane. Dylan stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of it. It was like stepping into a fever dream, an unsettlingly whimsical place where the rules of reality no longer applied. A woman behind the laughter stall smiled at him, the corners of her mouth curving upward with an eerie gleam. "Can I interest you in some joy, sir?" she asked in a voice that could have belonged to a fortune teller. Her tone was warm but too smooth, like she was selling more than just a product. She was selling an idea. He nodded slowly, unsure of how to respond. "What exactly do you mean by joy?" "Oh, nothing too extravagant," she said. "Just a jar of pure, unadulterated happiness. Guaranteed to make you feel like you're on top of the world for at least 20 minutes. "Right," Dylan said with a dry laugh, backing away. "I'll pass." He wasn't the kind of guy to buy into mystical nonsense. He wasn't really into any of the stuff that made people feel good, actually. Sure, he ate pizza and went to the occasional happy hour, but those were just distractions, fleeting moments. He was waiting for something bigger, something real. But happiness in a jar? That wasn't it. He was about to turn back, but then something caught his eye. It was a small, unassuming booth in the farthest corner of the room. The vendor there didn't try to catch his attention, didn't offer a wide, exaggerated smile. Instead, the booth was empty, save for a few jars filled with glowing liquids that pulsed rhythmically, like they had a heartbeat. The name of the stall was etched onto a small sign, "Emotions for Sale, Curious." Dylan approached. There was no one behind the counter. But as his fingers brushed over one of the jars, the air in the room changed. It was subtle at first, like a ripple in water, but Dylan could feel it deep in his bones, a sense of recognition, a strange sense that this was where he was meant to be. And then, as if by magic, the vendor appeared. She was a tall woman, her long hair a mix of dark and silver, though she didn't look old. There was a strange authority about her, an unspoken power that seemed to emanate from her as she gazed at him, as if she had been expecting him. "You've come for something," she said simply, as if she knew exactly why he was standing there, looking lost. Dylan didn't know what to say. "I'm not really sure what any of this is," he admitted, motioning vaguely to the glowing jars around him. The woman smiled, a knowing look in her eyes. "This is where people come when they need more than what life offers. This is where emotions are bought, sold, and traded. Take a look, if you like." Her words were hypnotic, and for some reason, Dylan found himself drawn to them. Emotions, bought and sold? It sounded insane. And yet, the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. People were always running after happiness, chasing after pain, craving the highs and lows of life. But here, it seemed like they could control it, bottle it up, carry it around like a commodity. "What's it cost?" he asked before he could stop himself. The woman's smile deepened. "Not much. If you're willing to give something up in return." Dylan's heart skipped a beat. What could he possibly have to give? He had nothing of value, no family, no connections, no deep-seated desires. What would he even offer? She gestured to a small jar of what appeared to be liquid sorrow, a thick, dark substance swirling inside. "Some people offer their pain, others their joy. It's all about finding the right balance." Dylan frowned. This was getting weirder by the second. "You're telling me people pay for this stuff?" She nodded slowly. "It's a market, after all. Emotions are the most valuable currency there is. It's all about what you're willing to trade." Dylan looked at the jar in front of him again. This time, he wasn't sure whether to be disgusted or fascinated. "I don't have anything to trade." "Oh, but you do," the woman said, her voice smooth. "Everyone has something. Everyone's got something to give up. All you need to do is feel." There it was again, feel. Dylan had never been good at that. He'd spent his whole life avoiding feelings, bottling them up, pushing them down. Feelings were a nuisance, a mess. So why was he standing here, staring at this woman who was offering him something he couldn't understand? But before he could ask another question, something strange happened. The jar of sorrow in front of him seemed to vibrate, and Dylan felt a sharp pang in his chest, a sudden rush of emotion he couldn't explain. He staggered back, gasping, as if something in the air had changed. The woman smiled, her eyes gleaming with an unsettling certainty. "You're already beginning to understand," she said, her voice no longer a whisper but an invitation. "All you have to do is choose." Dylan wasn't sure what happened next. He wasn't sure what had even changed inside him, but something had. The jar of sorrow was vibrating with a strange energy, like a pulse from deep within the earth, and he felt it in the pit of his stomach, that gnawing feeling that there was something he hadn't quite grasped yet. Something that made this all real. He looked at the woman again. She hadn't moved, but there was a knowing expression on her face, like she was waiting for him to catch up. "You're beginning to sense it," she said again, her voice softer this time, almost coaxing. "Emotions are energy. They flow through people like electricity. Some people know how to harness them, others let them burn them out." He glanced around the room. The vendors, all of them, were still and silent, as though they were watching him, too. And that's when he realized, the whole market was a facade. Or maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was real in ways he hadn't understood yet, in ways he wasn't meant to. The woman took a step forward, reaching for the jar of sorrow. She held it out to him, the glass glowing faintly in the dim light. Dylan's heart began to race as she spoke, her words like an incantation. Take it. You can feel it, the need for release. It's inside you. Dylan hesitated. He could feel it. That rush, the pull of something deep, almost primal. Something inside him was crying out for release. Not just the sorrow in the jar, but his own sorrow. The weight of everything he'd kept buried in his chest for years, the numbing sense of loss, the slow erosion of his passion, the overwhelming emptiness that stretched across every day. It wasn't that Dylan had been happy before, it was just that he'd never been anything. His feelings, his emotions, had been kept in a cage. Small, controlled. But something was different now. He could almost taste it in the air. The woman's voice interrupted his thoughts. Don't you want to feel, Dylan? Don't you want to live? A jolt ran through him, and before he even realized what he was doing, he reached out. He didn't know why. Maybe it was the exhaustion from a lifetime of numbness, maybe it was the quiet promise of the jar, or maybe it was just the fact that he had no idea what else to do. Whatever it was, he took it. The moment his fingers brushed the jar's cool surface, a shock of electricity shot up his arm. His heart thudded as the liquid inside the jar shimmered and seemed to come alive, swirling and twisting in strange patterns. He could feel the sorrow in it, not as a distant thing, but as a part of him, like it was his sorrow. The rawness, the pain, the grief of 1,000 lifetimes, a lifetime in every drop. Before he could stop himself, he opened the jar. The sorrow poured out, a thick black liquid that filled the air with a strange, oppressive weight. It was like drowning in soundless grief. The room around him blurred, and Dylan felt himself collapse, into the emotions, into that crushing dark cloud of hopelessness. He couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. All he knew was that he was submerged in it, but then, it was gone. He gasped for air, his chest tightening, the world spinning. The room was too bright now, the air too sharp, like he'd been transported back into his body after being lost in a dream. He blinked several times, disoriented, and looked around. The woman was watching him, her face unreadable. That was only sorrow, she said, her tone a little more serious now. But that's what people need, isn't it? They come here because they want to feel, and they'll pay for it. Some need their sorrow to validate their pain, others want it so they can escape it. You're already starting to understand. Dylan stood there, trying to catch his breath. It was as if the emotions had ripped him apart and sewn him back together again, only there was nothing left but an empty shell. His body trembled, his heart still racing in the aftershock. Why did I do that? He muttered to himself, as much to the woman as to the air around him. She smiled, soft and knowing. Because you wanted to. Don't pretend you didn't. The emotions are alive, Dylan. They're part of you now, and you're part of them. You've opened the door. Dylan shook his head, as though trying to shake off the weight of what had just happened. It was madness, all of it. He was losing himself, losing track of what was real, but that's when it hit him. The room was still humming, vibrating with energy, and now, more than ever, he felt alive. Not in the way he'd imagined, not in the sense of joy or peace, but in the sense of rawness. There was nothing left to hide behind. He felt like he was staring into the eyes of 1,000 people, 1,000 lives, each one filled with its own misery, its own beauty. His senses were heightened, and every step, every breath felt like an electric charge running through his veins. You're a supplier now, the woman said, and this time, it wasn't a suggestion. You've got what it takes. You can pull emotions from people, extract them, and trade them. You've just tapped into something greater than you can imagine. A cold shiver ran down his spine. A supplier, "I didn't ask for this," he muttered, not sure whether he was speaking to her or to the swirling chaos in his head. She raised an eyebrow. "Did you think you could just stumble into this place without something happening to you? Emotions aren't just things you walk away from. Once you've tasted them, they take hold of you. They consume you. You're already part of the market, Dylan. The sooner you accept that, the better." Dylan took a step back, his mind racing. His head felt like it was spinning out of control, and his stomach churned with unease. "What if I don't want this? What if I don't want to be part of your market?" The woman looked at him with pity, and it made his stomach tighten. "It's not about what you want, Dylan. It's about what you need. You need to feel something real. And once you've started, there's no going back. But you can stop if you choose, of course. But then you'll be just like the rest of them, empty, floating, waiting for something that'll never come." She paused for a moment, studying him with a look that was both predatory and calm. "The market is waiting for you, Dylan. You'll find your place soon enough." He wanted to leave. He wanted to run out of there and forget this whole thing ever happened, but deep down, there was a small, dangerous part of him that was already sinking into the idea of it. Maybe he was empty. Maybe he needed something more than what he had. Something real. Something raw. The emotions had filled him up in a way that he couldn't explain, and the idea of releasing more of them, taking them from others, selling them, feeling the rush of control, suddenly didn't seem so far-fetched. As he stood there, staring at the woman, at the jars of emotions, something inside him clicked. "I'll need a little time to think," he said. Though he wasn't sure whether he was asking for time or trying to buy himself an excuse, the woman smiled again, the same knowing smile. "Take your time. The market isn't going anywhere. But it's always open, Dylan. Always." Dylan's footsteps echoed in the alley as he stepped back from the stall, trying to shake off the feeling that the market had just swallowed him whole. The woman's words clung to him, following him like an invisible weight pressing on his shoulders. "The market is waiting for you." He had no idea what that meant, but something in him, the hollow part he didn't like to acknowledge, knew she was right. It wasn't just the emotions, it wasn't just the sensation of touching them, of feeling them swell inside him like a storm. It was the pull. The draw. The feeling that maybe, just maybe, this was what he'd been missing all his life. He turned down another alley, then another, wandering through the maze of streets, his mind a blur of disjointed thoughts. The emotions he'd absorbed still felt fresh inside him. He could taste the sorrow, the raw, open grief of it, still hanging on his tongue, bitter and sharp. It made his chest tighten, his stomach churn. But there was something else, too. A rush of clarity, of sharpness that cut through the fog of his previous life. It wasn't joy. It wasn't peace. It was something darker, more potent. It was power. Power over the intangible, over people's most vulnerable states. He could take their joy, their sadness, their anger. And he could sell it. He wasn't sure what he was thinking anymore. Was he already too far in? Did he even want to turn back? The thought of running, of pretending this hadn't happened, seemed impossible. It was like trying to erase a scar after it had already formed, a reminder of something deeper than physical pain. The market had marked him. He could feel it now in the thrum of his pulse, in the quiet pull of his own emotions twisting like a knot inside him. His phone buzzed in his pocket, yanking him out of his thoughts. He fumbled for it, not surprised to see a message from his coworker, Mike. "Got the report? We're waiting on you, man." Dylan stared at the message, then laughed, bitterly, under his breath. The report. It was always the report. Always the same dull requests, the endless cycle of tasks that never meant anything. He could barely remember the last time he'd felt anything approaching satisfaction from his work, or from anything in his life. And now? Now he had something that felt real, something he could control. The message was a reminder of the life he had left behind, the one that no longer seemed to matter. He shoved the phone back into his pocket and kept walking. Maybe he wasn't ready to dive into the market fully, not yet, but he couldn't pretend that it wasn't calling to him. The way the emotions danced behind his eyelids, the way the woman's voice had pulled him in, it all made sense in a way he wasn't ready to admit. Hours passed. He found himself back at his apartment building, standing outside the door, staring at the familiar lock, the worn doormat. It looked so ordinary now, the world outside so dull compared to what he'd experienced in the market. He wanted to throw his phone across the room, to forget the responsibilities that came with the life he had built, a life of quiet nothingness. Instead, he stood there, hands in his pockets, unsure of what to do. He walked inside, the air feeling too still, too suffocating. The apartment was empty except for the low hum of the refrigerator. Nothing had changed since he left, but everything inside him had. He could feel it now, the way the air itself seemed to be charged with something he couldn't quite name. He was different, and it scared him. The feeling of wanting more, of needing more, was overpowering. But he didn't know how to want it, how to dive into the unknown without losing himself entirely. That night, he barely slept. The memories of the market, the jars, the stalls, the heavy weight of emotions, kept turning over and over in his mind. He couldn't stop thinking about it. Couldn't stop wondering what it would be like to feel those emotions again, to pull them from others and experience them firsthand, without the barrier of indifference he had built over the years. By morning, he was restless, pacing the apartment, unable to focus on anything. The urge to go back was unbearable. He needed to see the woman again, to hear her voice, to feel the pull of the market. He needed to know what this all meant. The decision was almost instinctual. He grabbed his jacket, the same one he'd worn when he first walked into the alleyway, and stepped out into the street. The world was quieter than it should have been, like everyone around him was going through the motions of their lives while he stood apart, separate, as if the market had already begun to take hold of him. When he reached the alley again, the same strange sign flickered in the distance, casting an otherworldly glow against the dark brick walls. He walked faster now, as though his feet were carrying him without his consent. Inside, the market was unchanged, still filled with strange and curious sellers, the air thick with incense and the hum of anticipation. But it felt different to him this time. He wasn't a visitor anymore. He wasn't just someone wandering through. He was a part of it now, whether he liked it or not. The woman was at her stall, as though she had been waiting for him. She looked up when he approached, her eyes gleaming with something that could have been amusement, or perhaps something darker. "You came back," she said simply, her tone almost approving. "I knew you would." Dylan didn't answer at first. He didn't know what to say. He was here, and that was enough. He had crossed some invisible line, and now there was no turning back. "I don't know what to do," he said, his voice almost hoarse. "I don't know if I can keep doing this." She nodded, as if she had been expecting that. "You can't stop once you start. The emotions are inside you now. They're part of who you are. You just need to choose how you use them." Her words were sharp, but there was a quiet understanding in her gaze, like she saw through him, into the part of him he was trying to hide. "People come here for a reason," she continued, her voice lowering. "They need something. Whether it's joy, sorrow, fear, whatever it is, it's a craving, a hunger. And you, Dylan, you're in the business of fulfilling those needs." "I didn't ask for this," he muttered, though the words felt hollow now. He had asked for it, hadn't he? When he had opened that jar of sorrow, when he had felt that rush, that power, he had asked for it. And now there was no turning back. "Everyone asks for it in one way or another," she said softly. "But now that you're here, you'll see. There's more to the market than just selling emotions. It's about control. People don't just buy joy or sorrow, they buy power. And that power can change things. It can make or break lives." He swallowed hard. "How do I do it? How do I pull emotions from people?" The woman studied him for a moment before reaching out, her fingers brushing over a jar of glowing orange liquid. It's not about force. It's about connection. You'll learn how to tap into the emotions of others, to pull them into you and release them at will. But be careful, Dylan. People don't give up their emotions easily. And the more you take, the more you lose yourself. He nodded, though the words felt like a warning he couldn't fully understand. He didn't know what to think. He didn't know if he could trust her. But there was something in his gut, something telling him that he needed this. He needed to feel something real. You'll see, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. The market gives you what you need, but it takes something from you in return. That's the price. Dylan stood there for a long moment, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know what the price was yet, but he would. He would find out soon enough.